Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a rather tardy return to the Hyborian Age. I know it's been quite a while since I've done one of these Conan Bande Dessinée reviews, but I've been a bit busy with other stuff, and I have to admit, another reason is I was a bit apprehensive to do this particular one because, spoiler warning, I'm not a fan. This of the Climax Bande Dessinée adaptations is my least favorite, but I'm getting ahead of myself. This is the Scarlet Citadel, La Citadel Écarlate, originally published in January of 1933 in the pages of Weird Tales by Robert E. Howard, of course. It concerns King Conan. This is the second story that was ever written for the character, and again, we are doing the future chronology of King Conan on this throne of Aquilonia. Although he starts off not so much on that throne, he's been taken prisoner by the kings of Koth and Ophir and their behind-the-scenes master, Tsothalanti, a half-demon sorcerer who's the secret power behind the throne of those kingdoms. Suffice to say, things go bad for Conan for quite a bit. He ends up thrown into the eponymous dungeons of the Scarlet Citadel, and, has to bust out, meeting some interesting allies and facing some rather nasty creatures on the way out. It's a classic story, and it has a really fun ending to it, too. But in this case, we were talking about the comic book adaptation. The third such of the title, the original comic book adaptation by Roy Thomas and Frank Brunner, was in Savage Sword of Conan number 30 back in 1978, and Dark Horse, of course, had their own in the pages of King Conan and the Scarlet Citadel by Tim Truman and Thomas Giarello in 2011. This one is by Luc Brunschwig and Étienne Leroux, who's on the art in this case. So, the art, speaking of which, there's nothing wrong with that. As far as I can tell, the art is actually it's not necessarily my favorite of the artistic styles that's been used for all these comics. I find that sometimes the colors can be a bit flat in places. There's, some good uses. The battle scenes in the early pages are really good in going then to the endings and such. You get, a good sense of place. The images are very clear. It's very easy to see what's going on. But I find that there's a bit of a lack of line work and shading in certain places. The art can feel a little bit empty in certain ways. But otherwise, it's still very high quality. The only peeve I have with it is that it makes Aquilonia look very medieval. Like medieval Europe kind of thing. Now, this is completely legitimate choice. After all, the way Howard writes these stories, especially these ones, and I think Black Colossus too, quite a bit, it describes knights in armor and stuff like that, and their weapons and things. It's very much described using terms that would easily be translated visually to the medieval period. Personally, when it comes to sword and sorcery and the Hyborian Age in particular, I prefer something that goes a bit more to antiquity, so late Roman Empire, that kind of thing, especially for Aquilonia. But that's just my own personal pet peeves. You can see this a lot in the Dark Horse adaptation. It's actually, a bit more in that style. Not too much, but you get an idea of the kind of visual I'm talking about here. So, art-wise, there's really nothing I can really say that's too bad about it. It's nice and gory, lots of, good action, good violence, all the stuff that you want out of this kind of thing. I think there's a particular standout is, of course, when Conan meets the sorcerer Pelias in the Scarlet Citadel's dungeons, and he's in the grips of this alien, slightly extra-dimensional plant that is sucking his mind dry in order to keep him prisoner and prevent him from using his magic to escape. And the image of him just hanging in the vines with a flower almost growing out of his face, out of his eye socket, and the vines going into his mouth, into his nostrils and stuff, is, as usual for these depictions, very, very nasty in the way it's shown. I would say that the one in Dark Horse's version of the story is probably a lot freakier looking, but such is what it is. It fits with the art style while still keeping that level of, ick factor that's inherent to this particular situation this guy's in. Unfortunately, as far as the rest of it, I'm just not okay with the way the adaptation was done. It starts out fine. Up until you get to the point where Conan is thrown into the dungeons, everything follows the original story very well. Things, just keep the same clip. Nothing's been, removed and stuff like that. And then you get to the very first problem. Conan's very first creature he encounters down there is a gigantic serpent with a head big enough to bite a horse in half in a single snap of its jaws. It's called Satha, And it's one of the few, like these giant serpents that are all over the place in Howard's canon that actually has a name. And it's kind of interesting because this serpent is not the only time it shows up. There's another story called The Valley of the Worm, where this huge mythical, demonic horror of a snake is also featured. And there it makes a very important appearance as well. Here, it's a giant toad. I'm sorry, but already like that, when I got to this page the first time I read this one, I was like, what the hell? Like, that's wrong. That's not right. I get that previous to this, there have been quite a few issues of this particular series that also include giant serpents, but that's really their own fault for picking those stories to put, to publish in that order. I mean, can hardly be blamed for that. But, okay. Aside from the fact that in the story it's mentioned that a drop of venom from that snake that hits his leg would leave us in a scar he carry for the rest of his life, which is, it's not a plot point or anything like that, but it's just like interesting little mention of stuff is absent, of course. But beyond that, it doesn't really change anything to the story itself. So, okay. We can forgive this particular aspect. We then go to move along, and there's an interesting thing that I do kind of like, is where we spend also flashing back, moving from both the dungeon to the cities of Aquilonia that are being taken over. And, we're following also this minstrel, who's basically the one who announces, the situation at the start to the Aquilonians that Conan's been captured and stuff like that. And, captured. They think he's dead at this point. And we follow him for a bit as he is encountering his replacement, Prince Arpello, who's being set up as, cat's paw by the Kothians and the Furians. And we follow him for a little bit as he kind of like acts as our point of view on the situation currently in Aquilonia. I can understand that, since otherwise you spend all your time with Conan and spend very little time seeing what's going on back in the hometown. So it's a good choice to have. Unfortunately, it takes up space that could have probably been best served for other areas in order to, add more flesh to the bones here. Because once we get back into the dungeon itself, Conan starts encountering the other inhabitants of these, dark and sinister tunnels here. And there are some interesting things. There's this one thing that looks like a turtle crossed with a horse or a camel or something, which is, freaky in and of itself. But beyond that, there are three creatures it encounters, basically a weird kind of like tiger griffin thing, some weird bats with monkey heads. Mostly it's just like, weird crossbreeds of various animals and stuff like that. Whereas in the original story, he encounters this horrifying, betentacled, Shoggoth-looking horror show that's weeping and then laughing with the voice of a young woman in distress. And you never find out whether it's mocking or, mimicking one of its last victims, or if it's one of Sotholanti's own victims transformed into this nightmare thing. And that was when just that one moment really shows, the kind of like Lovecraftian influence on that Conan has, that Robert E. Howard took from Lovecraft and applied to the Conan tales. And, we then enter this well that he encounters here. In the original stories, he doesn't go down it. He thinks maybe he could escape from there, but something comes up, this, luminous, fantastical horror that comes out of it, and, he literally just, gets this hell away from it. Here, he climbs down to it, and it's this vapor that goes into his mouth and eyes and has him flash back to his youth or something like that, being surrounded by wolves. And it's I find it very pedestrian a bit. It's like 2 whole pages here, pages 34 and 35, that I think could have best been served to really flesh out the whole, nightmarish, cavalcade of horrors being, locked away in this dungeon below this fortress, with the Satha as the main guardian down there, just, patrolling between the cells and keeping everything else in line there, acting as, the head honcho of this prison for horror and for nightmares. Right now, there's really nothing particularly frightening all that much about the dungeons that Conan's locked in. I mean, this should be some kind of thing that where here he is like freaking out a bit, as he was in the original stories. Then come back to Arpello. He ends up, killing the minstrel out in a fit of rage because he, mentions like, oh, well, people were happier with Conan, and, now he's dead, and now they're all doubting you. He's like, what the hell? Arr! And it's just, demonstrating how poor of a ruler this guy actually is. We then get to Pelias, and that, that's a great moment. We then kind of like move back here, and we get to this other point here. South Atlanti has a crystal ball that he uses as a quick and dirty way of scrying on things. Pelias uses that, and Conan gets to see how things are going in Aquilonia. This, in the original story, was the first time we actually got some news of what was happening. And he sees the city of Shamar, which is the last city in between the Ophirian Kothian armies and his capital, Tamar. And in the book, it's under siege. We then move to Tamar, where he sees the situation there, which is kind of what we were seeing, in those other, cutaways with Arpello. But here, the siege is over, and the bad guys have won, and they're moving on Tamar. This right there, I honestly didn't necessarily notice it at first, but it really is the first point where things kind of go off the rails here, because it throws off the entire rest of the story, as we'll see, coming soon. So things continue from there. It's also normal, just as normal. Pelias summons, a terrible beast, the beast of the air, to carry him away as quickly as possible, which you don't see in the book, in the comic book here. It's missing. That's a scene like in the original Savage Sword adaptation. It's a pterodactyl that's, or a pterosaur or whatever, big flying dinosaur thingy, that Pelias summons forth to carry him away. In the Dark Horse version, it's this also Lovecraftian kind of almost like a Byakhee or a Migwo, it almost looks like, with the fake tentacle head thing that carries him off there. So you get more of that whole, sorcery aspect, the sword and sorcery part. Although there is still that scene where he raises the corpse of the jailer to, open the gate from the other side, which is, always a nice, creepy touch, considering that Pelias is one of the few depictions of a benevolent, quote-unquote, sorcerer in the Conan stories. There are really very few of them, and he's one of the only, actual examples here. We do, however, get to see the beast he's riding afterward as he's arriving, in Tamar, where basically he just, unceremoniously kills Arpello with his sword. That's not how he dies in the book. He picks him up and throws him off the battlements, which is, into the middle of the crowd, which would have been a great thing to have here, because that's what he does to that minstrel earlier. It would have been a great, setup, payoff. That would have been great. But instead, he just, shows up, stabs him, and screams to someone to bring him a horse so he can, get going. And here's that thing. It's in too much of a hurry, because here's the problem here. Instead of going from Tamar to Shamar, recruiting more people along the way, here he just recruits the local citizens of Tamar to fight with him, to arm themselves with whatever they can, and then they go off to face against the armies that are approaching the capital city. Here's how it's described in the actual book. Excuse me one moment. It was a motley army Conan had assembled in the wild hours following his return to his capital. He had beaten the frothing mob away from the Pelian soldiers who held the outer walls of Tamar and impressed them into his service. He had sent a swift rider after Tricero to bring him back. With these, a nucleus of an army, he had raced southward, sweeping the countryside for recruits and for mounts. Nobles of Tamar and the surrounding countryside had augmented his forces, and he had levied recruits from every village and castle along his road. Yet it was but a paltry force he had gathered to dash against the invading hosts, though of the quality of tempered steel. 1,900 armored horsemen followed him, the main bulk of which consisted of the Pointanian knights. The remnants of the mercenaries and professional soldiers and the trains of loyal noblemen made up his infantry, 5,000 archers and 4,000 pikemen. His host now came on in good order, first the archers, then the pikemen, behind them the knights moving at a walk. In this comic, it's basically, the motley army part is true, but unfortunately it's basically just a bunch of, poor citizens, beleaguered citizens with, whatever weapons that they can get their hands on. You see here in page 51, you've got this blacksmith here, for instance, picking up a big-ass sledgehammer, which is, all he's got, really. And unfortunately, it doesn't end there. Whereas in the original story, he's got a proper, military force, small, but, with a hard core of actual professional soldiers with, armor and equipment and all that stuff against, the armies that he's going up against. Here, he does not. and they suffer for it badly, which is actually brought to attention by Atalanta, who's like, hey, look back, see your men about to be slaughtered, including that, very same blacksmith there who we show as an example. There is getting stabbed all over the place with spears. And here's the other problem there. In this version of the story, Conan rushes off to face off against the kings of Koth and Ophir and Sotholanti. I never clear that Sotholanti or Sotholanti, so you forgive me if I alternate between the two. He goes up against them, faces them, when in reality, in the book, he stays with the army, clashes with the enemy army, takes out the kings who are commanding it, then goes after Sotholanti, who's been watching the whole thing from afar, and then faces him. Here, it makes the whole thing into this bittersweet kind of, oh, he won, but at what cost? And here's the thing. Conan, at this point of his life, has been a military commander for untold number of battles. I mean, since Black Colossus, in fact. He does not make this mistake of leaving his army behind uncommanded, or, not taking the time to recruit a, sizable force with experience. Here, it's just like, it's amateur hour, and it kind of brings down the tone of triumph that is supposed to come at the end of the story. It does not feel right, especially if you have already familiar with the original story. It just does not work as well. Yeah, you get the whole thing where Sotholanti gets his head cut off, then gets back up and tries to, grab his head, only for Pelias is to send something to go grab his head and just take it off while he's laughing from a distance. And then, he has that great line like, ugh, these sorcerers, I'm so done with them. Like, just give me as an enemy I can hit with a sword and a mug of ale afterwards. I'm done. Good for that. Whereas here, he kind of gives a similar line, but it's as he's attacking then the kings of Ophir and Koth. And it's like, at that point, the story should have already been over, and the story should have been over better, because it was done better in the original. If they just stuck with that instead of making all these changes, the original feel and point and, ending of the story would have been great. Instead, it's just, I don't know, it just does not work for me anymore. I'm sure that if someone who is less familiar with the original story would probably get better appreciation for it. I mean, that's just inevitable. Obviously, I'm reviewing this in full knowledge of the original story and its prior adaptations by Marvel and Dark Horse. But unless you must have this one, this is about the only one I recommend skipping. And I say this as someone who actually owns the actual physical copy of it. It's simply not, I think, up to the same level of adaptation as the other books in this series. Simply not. And I'm sure Luc Brunschwig and Étienne Leroux had the best of intentions with this. I mean, you don't get into the the racket of making these things unless you actually enjoy the stories. I mean, I don't see any way they would have gotten selected for working on this if they didn't at least have a good head on their shoulders when it comes to this. But unfortunately, the adaptation itself leaves to be desired, and it brings down what would otherwise be a very good bande dessinée. So yeah. The Scarlet Citadel, La Citadel Écarlate. If you must have it, okay. There's enough good in here, I think, that someone who has never been, exposed to Conan, or particularly this story of Conan, might get something more out of it than I did. For me, it's a pass. And if you're the kind of person who's a bit of a Howard purist, it'll definitely be a pass, I'm sorry to say. The next one of these ones is Chimère de Fer de la Clarté Lunaire. Now that one really is where things pick up. That one's by Virginie Augustin, who does both the writing and the artwork. That one is going to be worth looking into when we get to that one. I have been Zero Sum. You can like, share, subscribe, and all that stuff. And I will see you next time. Bye, Crom.